Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with Developer University. For more of my training videos for beginners, please visit me at devu.com. In this video, we're going to take a look at another iteration statement. We're going to look at the while iteration statement. So if we kind of do a quick review on the iteration statements that we've already learned about, first of all, we looked at the for iteration statement, which allows us to loop through a block of code a preset number of times based on how many items that we've kind of decided in the for statement itself. So we create a counter of sorts, and it will iterate through the number of times in our counter. So there's a preset number of iterations through a given block of code. We also looked at the for each, which iterates through a block of code once for every item inside of an array. And so again, that's kind of a preset. You decide ahead of time how many times you're going to iterate through a given block of code. But what about those situations where you don't know up front how many times you need to iterate through a given block of code? You need to decide that inside of the block of code. Inside the block of code will dictate how many times to iterate through the block of code. I'll give you a quick example of that. Well, in those cases, you'll use the while statement, and you'll test to see if a certain condition is true. If it's true, you'll continue to iterate. If it's false, you'll stop iterating. You'll break out of the loop. And then we'll also look at the do while statement, which is very similar, except it guarantees that you run through the block of code at least one time. So we'll look at that subtle difference in this lesson. To begin, you can see that I've already created a new project called while iteration. So you can pause the video, catch up with me. I just created a new project, named it while iteration, and there's going to be a lot of typing. So what I'll probably wind up doing is pausing the video while I type, and then I'll pause the video, or you should pause the video after I'm finished typing so that you can type in all the code that I typed, and then we'll explain it and walk through it together. All right, so here we go. I'm going to start with a really simple example of the while, and then we'll blow it out to a much more interesting example, something that's very practical that we would probably wind up using in a real console window application by creating a menu. But let's start simple. And so again, a lot of typing. I'm going to pause the video right about now. Okay, so this is a pretty simple example, like I said a moment ago. Here, all I'm doing is using this while and while statement to create a block of code. And we'll continue to execute this block of code until the user response variable is no longer true. When we set it to false, then we will break out of this while and while statement and continue on with the execution of our application. Now you'll see here that I am keeping track of a counter. So I have this counter variable that I've created in line number 5, and then line number 8, you can see that I'm adding 1 to that counter variable by taking the current value of counter and adding 1 to it. This is just to let me know that how many times I've actually run this block of code, just for a simple example. And then I'm going to print that to screen that this code block is executed that many number of times. And then I'm going to ask the question, do you want to continue or not? If the console.readLine is equal to y for yes, then we'll return true. When user response is true, then we'll go and execute this block of code another time. But if it's false, then this will no longer be correct or true, and we'll break out. And let's watch this actually run. The first time through, I'm going to type in the letter Y and hit enter. I'll type in the letter Y and hit enter. I'll type in the letter Y and hit enter. And then I'll type in the letter N and hit enter. And now we've finished, and I can press enter to exit. Okay. So what the while and while statement does, just to recap, is that it will continue to execute a given block of code until a given condition is no longer true. In this case, user response is kind of the key that we're using here to determine whether we should continue running through this block of code or not. All right, so again, a very simple example. What I'm going to do is actually select this entire block, comment this out. It's not a very practical example, so I want to give you something much more interesting to work with. And so for this next example, we're going to create a menu system like you might have seen if you ran DOS programs way back like 25, 30 years ago. Okay, so here we're going to go ahead and start typing. I'll pause the video and then you can catch up. Once I finish typing in, you'll want to pause the video, type in some of the code yourself. Okay. All right, so you can see here that, and again, please pause the video. I'll give you an opportunity to type in all of the code. I'll give you a nice clean screen like this. Pause right now because we want to start by writing this code to display a menu. So we're doing something similar here with the user response. We're just going to call it display menu this time as a Boolean. We're setting equal true, and while display menu continues to be true, then we'll continue iterating through. Now, you can see here that I did not have like an equals true. That's kind of redundant. You don't need to do that because display value, or display menu rather, is already a Boolean. It's going to be true or false. So all we need to do is just check whether the expression, in this case it's just a variable, equals true or false. Well, display menu already equals true, or it's going to equal false by its very nature because it's a Boolean. So you don't have to do the equals true or equals false part whenever you're evaluating a Boolean. Okay, so here's what we're doing. We're actually calling this other function called main menu, and then main menu will return back to us a Boolean, and then we'll decide whether to rerun the main menu based on the response that we get from main menu. So the real work goes on in this function main menu is Boolean. Here I'm going to clear out the console calling the clear method. All right, so that's a new method in the console. Here we'll just wipe out everything that was currently being displayed on screen. Then we're going to say, would you like to either play the print numbers game, the guessing game, or would you like to exit out of the menu system? Here we're going to retrieve the result from the user. What would you like to do, 1, 2, or 3? And here's where we then decide what are we going to actually do. Are we going to call into another method called print numbers because they want to play the print numbers game, or are we going to call into the guessing game method, and I'll show you those in just a moment because they selected number 2, or do you want to return false? All right, so in these cases, these methods will return a true or false. Here, when they want to exit, will return false. That'll get bubbled up through main menu into our main, and display menu will be set to false, so we'll break out and end the program at that point. Okay, so if they type in anything else, then we'll return true, which will return back to here, which will then set display menu back to true, which means we're going to call main menu again. We'll clear out and then say, all right, well, you didn't give us 1, 2, or 3, so I'm going to give you another chance to answer the question. And if you ever get confused about the flow of this application, just set a breakpoint and step your way through it using the debugging tools, right? So you can see how this actually works. Now, inside of the print numbers and the guessing game, for now, all I did was just implement console.writeLine. We're going to come back and flesh this out. So I've just stubbed out this method for the moment. But in both cases, we're going to return true, saying, okay, we finished the guessing game, or we finished the print numbers game. Why don't you just go ahead and re-show this menu to the user so they can decide what else they want to do inside of our application. So the nice thing about this little setup, and you can use this same little scheme that I've cooked up here to create multiple menu levels inside of a DOS-based, or rather a console-based application, okay? We'll flesh out these to show some more features of the while statement, and then also we'll look at that do, or the do while loop as well. Let's run the application and see how it works. So the first time through, we see there's a choose an option 1, 2, or 3. I'm going to choose number 1. And even though, unfortunately, you see that nothing really happened, the reason is because I forgot one line of code in both of these. Console.readLine, because we want to be able to show that text before we continue on. Okay, here we go. Let's do it again. Print numbers game here. I'll press number 2. The guessing game here. I press number 3, and it exits. All right. So that's how the menu system works. Now let's focus on another aspect of this print numbers method and the guessing game to look at 2 different coding examples revolving around the loops, the do while and the while loop. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video again here as I type in some more code. All right, so I went ahead and fleshed out the print numbers method. You can pause it and catch up here. And then I also created this guessing game method. You can see most of it on screen right now. Pause it right here if you want to catch up. And then you can pause to see this end part in lines 82, 83, 84. So like I said, a lot of typing. But you'll definitely want to catch up with me and type all this in. Let me explain a few things about how this works. So the print numbers game, let's just go ahead and run the game and see how it works. Let's choose number 1 and we can type a number. I'm going to choose the number 7, hit enter, and you can see all it does is just prints out from 1 to 7. And that's pretty simple, right? Then let's play the guessing game. It's a little bit more involved. And we get to guess a number between 1 and 10. This is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. I'll guess number 3. That was the wrong answer. Number 4. Number 2. Number 6, 7, 8, 9. What did I miss? 5? All right, it took me 9 guesses. All right, so we randomly choose a number from 1 to 10. It's pretty cool. And then we keep asking, what do you want to guess the number? We could improve this, and maybe that's a good exercise for you to say you're getting warmer or you're getting colder or it's higher or it's lower. Maybe give some hints as well. But now we can exit out of the game. So the print numbers game, recall, it was fairly simple. All we're doing here is just allowing the user to type in a number, and then we're going to actually read that number from the read line method. And notice that I've got this little cint. We're converting read line because it returns to us a string value, as you can see over there on the right hand side. But what we need to work with is an integer value, and the bucket sizes are different. So we're going to need to convert from the string, which if they type in the letter, the alphanumeric character 7, we need to convert that into the integer value of 7. Those are two different things, all right? So now that we have an integer, we can work with it in a mathematical sort of way, adding numbers to it and so on. As long as it's a string 7, if we were to attempt to add 1 to it, we'd probably get 7, 1 instead of 8, okay? At any rate, we create a counter just to keep track of how many times we're actually iterating through, and we're going to continue to iterate through until we get to the same result value that the user typed in, at which point then we'll pop out of our looping statement and continue on. All right, so for each number from 0 to, or as long as we're continue to be less than the value that was typed in, we'll continue to iterate through, but when this is no longer true, then we'll pop out of the iteration statement, okay? All right, so let's move on and look at the guessing game now. In the guessing game, you type in a number, and we are going to try and guess the number that the computer has selected. How do we get a number that the computer selects? We're going to use this class called Random. Random is a class created by Microsoft. Now, it's similar to the console class in so much that it's part of this library of code that Microsoft's allowed us to use inside of our applications, and it specializes in creating random numbers. But the way that we're using it is a little bit different. Like in this case, notice that all we had to do is just say console_class.clear, console_class.writeLine. Whereas in this case, we have to do something a little bit special. We have to create a new instance of the random class. And so we're creating a compartment in the computer's memory, a bucket in the computer's memory sufficiently large enough to hold this random data type. All right, and so we're going to call that bucket in the computer's memory random, lowercase r random. All right, so it's a little bit different than in the usage, and I'll explain the reason why, the different usage in an upcoming lesson when we talk about classes. All right. But at any rate, so now that we have an instance of the random class, we can use the random class's methods. In this case, we're going to use the next method to grab a number between 1 and 10. So we give it what's called the lower boundary. So I want a number that starts anywhere from 1, but I don't want you to go to 11. So that's the upper boundary. Don't go to 11, 12, 13. Stop at 10. So it's going to pick a random number from 1 to 10 and store that number here. We're also going to keep track of the number of guesses for the user. So if it took them 5, 6, 7 guesses, whatever the case might be. And then we're also going to create this incorrect Boolean flag because I'm going to anticipate that the user will be incorrect a number of times, and this will be what ultimately breaks us out of the do while loop and say you were correct. It only took you 12 guesses, okay? And then we'll actually show the number of guesses on screen. Now what happens inside of this code block is important. Notice that we're not using the while statement, we're using that do while loop that I alluded to a moment ago. And remember, the quality of the do while loop is that it guarantees we're gonna run this code at least one time. So in this case, I need to at least one time make sure that the user can see that they can choose a number between 1 and 10. And then every subsequent time, I'm gonna ask them again, all right, you were wrong, which is pick a number between 1 and 10. You were wrong, pick a number between 1 and 10. So I needed that inside of the code block, inside of my loop, and I needed to run it at least once. That's why do while loop made sense in this example, okay? Now, we're gonna retrieve the guess from the user, and then we're going to increment the counter of guesses. Now I could have done something like this, like I did previously, guesses equals guesses plus 1, but I chose to use a little shortcut, which is the plus equal, and so those two lines of code are equivalent. I just had to type fewer characters. So take the variable guesses and add 1 to it is essentially what line number 74 says. All right, next up, we're going to take a look here at the little check that we do. Now, we're going to grab the random number from the user. And this is the important part. Notice that random number is an integer, but I'm going to convert it to a string by calling the toString method. I could have done something like we did earlier with cstr, like that, and that would work just as well. So I'm going to convert this value to an integer. I'm going to convert this value to a string. I'll just go ahead and leave it like this. So we're converting data types. So this is an integer, but I need it to be a string so that I can compare it to the result. I just did the same basic thing two different ways here in these two different methods. But it's essentially the same kind of check. If the guess is incorrect, then incorrect will equal, or I'm sorry, if the result is equal to the random number, so if they guessed the correct number, then it's no longer incorrect. It'll be correct. So we're going to set incorrect equals to false, which will then break us out of the loop. However, if they are in fact incorrect, incorrect will stay true, and we'll just say, hey, you're wrong, try it again, and we'll loop through this block of code another time. But assuming that they got it correct, we bust out, and then we just merely print this to screen, and then we return true in order to get back to our menuing system and allow somebody, the user, to choose a new game. All right. So hopefully you learned quite a bit in this lesson. We looked at a simple use case where we're just using the while statement in order to evaluate something and decide whether we should continue to iterate through the block of code based on something that happens inside of the block of code. We looked at how to create a menuing system using the while loop. And then we also looked at using the while loop in some creative ways in a more practical example here. And then we looked at using the do while just to compare the while versus the do while. The only difference is running the block of code a guaranteed time, at least once, versus not running it potentially one time. And then we also looked at a few other things like converting types using the cstr, so convert to string and convert to int method. We also looked at using the plus equal operator. So we also looked at the random class and how we're able to generate a random number. Now we can create some interesting little games. All right, so hopefully that was a pretty helpful lesson. A lot of typing, but again, that's good for you, creating muscle memory. New observations come whenever you're typing the code in yourself as opposed to just watching somebody else do it. So make sure you're getting your hands dirty in the code. All right, we'll continue on the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thanks.